The mystery of debt's role in history. Imagine this, an ancient civilization thriving with wealth, power, and influence. The streets are full of commerce, the empire is expanding, and its armies are invincible. But beneath the surface of prosperity lies a hidden force, quietly pulling the strings of every decision, every war, and every social upheaval. That force? Debt. For centuries, we've been taught that the rise and fall of civilizations is driven by factors like war, revolution, or the collapse of political systems. But what if the true catalyst was something far more subtle, yet far more destructive? What if debt, the very thing that today controls our lives and economies, was the ultimate driving force behind the success and failure of the greatest empires in history? In this video, Boshavoy will uncover how debt played a pivotal role in shaping the rise and fall of civilizations, from ancient Rome to modern times. You'll see how the clever use of credit fueled vast empires, and how the reckless accumulation of debt led to their eventual collapse. We'll explore the origins of debt, its use by the powerful, and its ultimate consequences. Prepare to rethink what you know about history and money. Origins. The birth of debt. Debt, in one form or another, has existed since the dawn of civilization. To understand how debt shaped the rise and fall of empires, we must first look at its origins. The first known use of debt dates back to around 3000 BC in Mesopotamia. Here, in the Fertile Crescent, ancient Sumerians and Babylonians began to develop a sophisticated system of credit based on grain and livestock. The concept was simple. If you borrowed grain or animals from a neighbor or a landowner, you would pay it back with interest. These early forms of debt were used to fund agriculture, military campaigns, and infrastructure projects. As trade grew, so did the use of debt, with merchants borrowing to finance long-distance trade and kings borrowing to fund their armies. By the time the ancient Egyptians rose to power, debt had become an essential part of the economy. Pharaohs borrowed money to build monumental projects like the pyramids, which, while awe-inspiring, were also incredibly costly. However, there was a fine line between using debt to fuel growth and using it to fuel destruction. This line would become blurred over time, and we would see how empires learned to walk that dangerous tightrope. Rise, debt fuels expansion. As civilizations grew, so did the scale and complexity of their economies. The Roman Empire, at its peak, is perhaps the most famous example of an empire whose rise was fueled by debt. Under the rule of Augustus, Rome transformed from a city-state into a global empire, conquering vast territories and establishing a complex financial system to fund its military conquests. Rome, like many other empires, relied on a system of credit that allowed it to borrow money to fund military campaigns, infrastructure projects, and public services. Roman coinage, backed by the empire's power and military might, became a trusted form of currency used to facilitate trade across the empire. But the most important aspect of Roman debt was how it enabled the expansion of the empire. By taking out loans from wealthy merchants and neighboring kingdoms, Rome was able to finance its legions, which in turn conquered new lands, brought in new resources, and generated more wealth. This feedback loop of borrowing to expand, expanding to gather wealth, and borrowing more to fund further expansion became the driving force of the empire's early success. Yet, as history has shown, there is a limit to how much debt an empire can accumulate before it begins to feel the weight of its obligations. Rome, for all its greatness, would eventually reach that tipping point. Breaking point, the dark side of debt. The Roman Empire's rise through debt and conquest was not without its costs. As the empire expanded, so did its need for resources, both military and economic. The Roman government relied increasingly on borrowing from wealthy elites, leading to growing inequality and mounting national debt. By the time of the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire's debt had reached unsustainable levels. The empire's vast army required constant funding, and the cost of maintaining a sprawling empire grew exponentially. The government's solution? To print more money, essentially debasing the Roman currency. This created inflation. As the value of money fell and prices for goods skyrocketed. As inflation spread, the empire's wealth became concentrated in the hands of a few elite families, while the majority of the population, particularly farmers, suffered from poverty and heavy taxation. This growing financial strain eventually led to the empire's breaking point. The failure to manage debt properly meant that Rome could no longer sustain its military campaigns, and its borders began to collapse. The empire was attacked from both within and without, by invading barbarian tribes and by internal revolts. In the end, the debt-driven expansion could not be sustained, and the Roman Empire fell. Fallout, the consequences of debt. The fall of the Roman Empire marked the beginning of a dark age in Europe, where empires crumbled and the world was plunged into economic chaos. But the effects of Rome's debt crisis did not end with its fall. The consequences of reckless borrowing echoed through history, leading to the eventual rise of medieval kingdoms that relied on debt to rebuild. In the centuries following the fall of Rome, kingdoms in Europe began to use debt to finance their expansion. Just as Rome had done, monarchs borrowed from wealthy landowners and merchants to fund their military campaigns and territorial acquisitions. But this cycle of borrowing and expansion would eventually lead to more debt, more inflation, and more economic instability. The most notable example of this is the rise and fall of Spain in the 16th century. During its golden age, Spain borrowed heavily to fund its wars against France, England, and the Ottoman Empire. The country's vast wealth from colonies in the Americas only masked the underlying financial instability. By the late 1500s, Spain had declared bankruptcy multiple times, and its empire, once the wealthiest in the world, began to collapse under the weight of its debt. Similarly, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the French monarchy's reckless spending and debt accumulation led to the French Revolution. Louis XVI's government had borrowed heavily to fund wars and lavish spending, and by 1789, France's national debt had become insurmountable. The resulting financial crisis sparked widespread unrest and eventually led to the downfall of the monarchy and the rise of revolutionary France. Failed fixes, attempted solutions, and their limits. Throughout history, many civilizations have attempted to fix their debt crises with various solutions, some of which worked temporarily, but none of which addressed the root cause of the problem: unsustainable borrowing. In the case of Rome, attempts to solve the empire's financial troubles included debasing the currency, increasing taxes, and relying on the wealth of conquered territories. However, these measures only provided short-term relief and exacerbated the long-term problem of economic instability. Spain's attempts to resolve its debt crisis in the 16th century included issuing more bonds and borrowing from foreign creditors. However, as the empire's revenues declined, it became impossible to repay these loans, and Spain's financial collapse was inevitable. Even in modern times, we see nations resorting to similar tactics. Countries like Greece and Argentina have repeatedly faced financial crises fueled by unsustainable debt levels. And while short-term solutions like austerity measures and foreign loans have been implemented, they often fail to address the underlying issue: the unsustainable accumulation of debt. Modern parallels: debt in today's world. Fast forward to today, and debt is still one of the most powerful forces driving global economies. In fact, modern societies are more indebted than ever before. In 2021, global debt reached a staggering $281 trillion and more than 350% of global GDP. Just like the ancient civilizations, today's economies are built on credit and borrowing. Governments, corporations, and individuals alike rely on debt to fuel growth. But as we've seen in history, this cycle can only continue for so long before it leads to collapse. For example, the 2008 financial crisis was largely caused by reckless lending and borrowing in the housing market. Banks issued subprime mortgages to borrowers who couldn't afford them, leading to an unsustainable debt bubble. When the bubble burst, it triggered a global financial meltdown that wiped out trillions of dollars in wealth. Even now, countries like the United States and Japan are facing mounting national debt, and many economists fear that this could lead to a financial crisis in the coming years. The same pattern we've seen throughout history, rising debt, followed by collapse, appears to be repeating itself. 3 key takeaways. Debt can fuel growth, but it comes with consequences. While debt can be used to finance expansion and development, if not managed carefully, it can lead to economic instability and collapse, as seen in Rome, Spain, and other civilizations. Short-term fixes don't solve the problem. Throughout history, civilizations have attempted to solve debt crises with quick fixes, like printing more money or increasing taxes. But these measures often provide temporary relief and worsen the long-term problem. 3. The cycle of debt repeats itself. The rise and fall of civilizations due to debt shows a repeating pattern in history. Modern economies are not immune to this, and the lessons of the past should serve as a warning for the future. A warning for the future. As we look to the future, we must ask ourselves, are we repeating the mistakes of the past? Are we, like the Romans, using debt to fuel our growth without considering the long-term consequences? The rise and fall of civilizations due to debt offers valuable lessons, but it's up to us to learn from history and avoid the same traps. Will we break the cycle of debt? Only time will tell. If you found this video insightful, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into the history of finance. Let's keep exploring the forces that shape our world and how we can use the lessons of the past to navigate the future. What's your take on the role of debt in the rise and fall of civilizations? Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear from you.